Hi there, and welcome to My Zen Brain, another book report. I am Andy. Uh, Glad to have you, and it's been a while since I was able to put out anything in the My Zen Brain moniker because I have been pretty busy at work and I have been uh, keeping myself occupied with going to the gym a lot and um, just otherwise disposed. So I'm sorry, otherwise indisposed. But I'm back, and so this is a another book report, and I hope to have yet another book report out sometime very soon. And after that, I think that my schedule will have settled down a little bit, and I can go back to start recording podcasts. Um, but for the purposes of this morning, I am going to review The Case Against Sugar by Gary Taubs. It was a Joe Rogan podcast with Nina Teicholz where I first heard about Gary Taubes' book, The Case Against Sugar. Taubes is a journalist and science writer by trade, and in 2002, he wrote the seminal New York Times article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? And this article and the book, The Case Against Sugar, he wrote more than a decade later, came out in 2016, were the first seeds planted in what has become, for me at least, something between a hobby and an obsession with nutrition in general, and specifically its effect on the brain. Prior to getting sober, I was a lifelong sugar junkie, complete with the root beer belly at around age 7. I had a love affair with food that peaked when I was slapping together ham and cheese sandwiches at 2 in the morning in the Valley Hope kitchen where I went to rehab. Um, Apparently, they let you just, if you're detoxing, you can help yourself to whatever you want in the kitchen. Um, when I first checked in at Valley Hope, I didn't understand why I didn't automatically drop 20 pounds upon getting sober, since I had stopped the daily flood of a few thousand alcoholic calories into my liver. And I had also joined a gym within weeks of getting out of rehab because I was going to get my buzz somehow, god damn it. And if it was an endorphin buzz, followed shortly after by coffee and meetings and cigarettes, and most important of all, sugar, all the better. Never really occurred to me that the bag of chocolate and Starbursts and Nerds I kept under my bed at the Three Quarters house, and really just moved to a cabinet when I moved into a regular place, might be keeping me from losing any weight. And it turned out the sober life is even more conducive to listening to podcasts as it was to reading. And I was doing a lot of both. So I listened to a lot of the Joe Rogan podcast because he was hosting a lot of guests like Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz and Rhonda Patrick, authors and speakers who were talking about a broad and blossoming philosophy that essentially chastised numerous governmental and industry organizations for pushing a diet for 50 years that essentially made Americans specifically and humans who consumed a westernized diet generally fat, sick, and likely to die early, and die worse than necessary due to a cluster of diseases resulting from a diet loaded with sucrose and fructose. Taubes' book, The Case Against Sugar, published in 2016, was jaw dropping in two ways. The first was the message of the book, and the second was the level of research that Taubes brings to the table for presenting his case. It is exhausted, and I haven't dug deeper with Taubes' work because I soon became entrenched in the works of Max Lucaveri and Dr. David Perlmutter and John Rady and other authors whose books on nutrition and exercise and how they affect the brain I quickly digested. I wanted to understand the brain, and one of the most comprehensive ways to do that was by learning how the brain reacts to meditation, exercise, nutrition, music, and anything else that I could get my hands on. So it's important to me to stress that I am not an expert on anything. So I come to the task of learning about anything with an open mind, and as we say in Buddhist circles, a don't know mind. A surefire way to guarantee the stagnation and ultimate calcification of malleable knowledge into the more rigid wisdom is to cauterize the feelings, to cauterize the willingness to always be learning. So Taubs clearly states in his author's note for at the beginning of the book that the purpose of the book is to illustrate that sucrose and fructose, if the consumption of which is left unchecked, will be the cause of a cluster of diseases that will kill us prematurely. Quote, its goal is to explain why these sugars are the most likely suspects for the dietary trigger for uh, uh, my addition, the conditions of diabetes, obesity, and cancer. Yet the prime suspects for the dietary trigger for these conditions have been, until the last decade, treated as little worse than a harmless pleasure. Taubes entitles his first chapter Introduction, Why Diabetes? But really, the book aims to explain how the group of chronic diseases related to the Western lifestyle, and specifically the Western diet, are all related to the overconsumption of sugar. Taubes details how he will explain how heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease can all be traced back to the overconsumption of sugar. Taubes gives fair warning about the murky waters that surround the debate and the controversial history of the attitude around sugar's role in the cultural and public awareness of diet and health. Since Taubes himself carries out what, in my opinion at least, is an exhaustively thorough inclusion and evaluation of source material and a logical approach to all sides of the arguments he presents, I don't have to do any of that here. Just know that after reading this book, I was convinced enough to dig deeper into the effect of nutrition and exercise on the brain and thus the mind, and was rewarded with a reading list that grows almost weekly. As Max Lugavere stated in his book Genius Foods, the body of knowledge and research on how diet affects neuroplasticity in the brain in general increases almost yearly in the 21st century. So the comparison Taubes uses at the outset of his book, and which grabbed my attention immediately, was sugar as a drug that can have myriad negative side effects in the long term for the sake of what has been delegated the title of relatively harmless instant gratification in the short term. I first read The Case Against Sugar a few years ago, and I started again in the past year. With the pandemic that effectively began around February of 2020 came along, with it a dramatic plunge in my efforts to modulate my diet at all. And my parallel efforts to quit smoking once and for all picked back up in January of 2021 after I again read the section of The Case Against Sugar pertaining to how the addition to American cigarettes of sugar makes them infinitely easier to inhale and thus become addicted to. And just like that, my efforts to eradicate sugar from my diet quickly took their place in the on deck circle, while quit smoking came to the plate. I was successful in quitting entirely for the first 4 months of 2021. I relapsed in April, and the relapse lasted until I began abstinence again in August. And I'm currently more than a month out of my last cigarette, and thanks to a good friend who told me about the Quit Smoking app, I'm pretty sure it's going to stick this time. Quitting sugar, or at least dramatically reevaluating my approach to consuming sugar, as at the top of the list of specials for 2022. Back to Taubes. Early on, he gets pretty far into the weeds on how sugar consumption affects everything from the epidemics of obesity, heart disease, and dementia, to the cultural evolution of sugar consumption. He provides backstory on everything from the post Kellogg's rivalry to create the most delicious and Rocky and Bullwinkle friendly breakfast cereal out there, to the inclusion of Hershey chocolate bars and Army C rations, to the soft drink wars that continue to this day. And he also details how the evolution of sugar consumption in the Western diet has exploded over the years to the point where it is really, really, really hard to even avoid consuming sugar in any meaningful way, as sucrose and high fructose corn syrup are ubiquitous in American culture and the American diet. Again, I can't do justice to Taubes' arguments, so I will just include the last paragraph in the chapter preceding his descent into said weeds. And Taubes writes, nutritionists have found it in themselves to blame our chronic ills on virtually any element of the diet or environment, on fats and cholesterol, on protein and wheat, on gluten and glycoproteins, growth hormones and estrogens and antibiotics, on the absence of fiber, vitamins, minerals, and surely on the presence of salt, on processed foods in general, on overconsumption and sedentary behavior, before they'll concede that it's even possible that sugar has played a unique role in any way other than merely getting us all to eat too damn much. And so, when a few informed authorities over the years did indeed risk their credibility by suggesting sugar was to blame, their words had little effect on the beliefs of their colleagues or on the eating habits of a population that had come to rely on sugar and sweets as the rewards for the sufferings of daily life. Yeah. In the next chapter, the first 10,000 years, Taubes details how, for the majority of human history, right up until the 1950s and 60s, the macronutrient, quote unquote, sugar enjoyed something close to a carte blanche status in its addition to virtually every single goddamn foodstuff in the standard Western diet. Beginning in the Middle Ages, all four of the four horsemen of addiction in the Western diet, tea, coffee, tobacco, and chocolate, were all given a dose of foodstuff steroids with the addition of sugar. And then came candy and ice cream and soft drinks and on and on. He covers exhaustively not only the evolution of sugar's influence on the standard Western diet, but also how the academic and medical research has evolved alongside it over the decades. He further implicates established institutions like the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association, among other entities, in the alteration and manipulation of any research that was conducted on the effects of sugar in the American diet, complete with accusations of bribery and manipulation of the research. Taubes describes how ultimately a 1977 FDA report on food additives essentially laid down a sugar laden yellow brick road that the sugar industry used to effectively brainwash the nutritional establishment into thinking that sugar was indeed harmless, and thus began a half century of Americans and other adherents and would be adherents to the standard American diet across the globe started consuming way too much sugar, and the institutions of health and wellness ultimately paying the price. Hospitals, doctors, wellness clinics of every kind. Let's see. Of those five diseases that Taubes maintain are caused by excessive sugar consumption, maybe not caused by it, but certainly accelerated, all were spawned by the preexistence of insulin resistance caused by that overconsumption. Taubes states in one single paragraph at the end of his argument that if sugar actually causes insulin resistance, as the biochemistry and animal experiments suggest, then it is also very likely the trigger for excessive fat accumulation and thus obesity. Remove the sugar, and the insulin resistance improves. Weight is lost, and not because the subject ate less, but because their insulin resistance was resolved. The sugar industry doesn't see it that way. Unquote. Taubs sums up his argument with the last two paragraphs on pages 208 and 209, and he does a better job than I did, and than I do. He states, one second. The number of researchers interested in studying sugar and fructose and worrying about the metabolic effects of consuming them is certainly growing, as is the willingness of health organizations worldwide to fund laboratory research, or at least to discuss such funding. But this has yet to be accompanied by the kind of human trials that might identify what happens when we consume sugar or high fructose corn syrup for years, and at what level of consumption we incur a problem. As of the fall of 2016, fewer than a dozen clinical trials, all small and of short duration, were ongoing in the United States that might actually establish anything that the researchers who pay attention to the literature haven't known for decades. So the answer to the question of whether sugar in the form of sucrose and high fructose corn syrup is the primary cause of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, and therefore obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, is it certainly could be. The biological mechanisms that were elucidated by the 1970s make it clear that sugar is a prime suspect and should have been all along. So, for me personally, and my treasure hunt to find the things that will kick me in the ass enough to make some changes to how I'm living, the case against sugar was a watershed moment for me. I'm not interested in the detailed arguments for or against Taubes' many positions that, in my opinion at least, are well researched and certainly pass my critical thinking test. And I hope I can redirect with my contention that The Case Against Sugar is at least a compelling book that will at least get more people thinking about food and nutrition and exercise and how they affect, for good and ill, the health of our brains. So there it is. I really enjoyed the book. The book is it's eye opening. And I listened to a couple podcasts that the author Gary Taubes was on, including Joe Rogan, a couple podcasts that he was on. And so you can revisit those if you want to, or I'm sorry, you can visit those. It would be a revisit for me. If you desire, and there's a blossoming body of literature, and so after I get done with the next book report, Into the Magic Shop, I will probably resume rereading and bringing more book reports on diet. There's Grain Brain, and there's Genius Foods, which I mentioned. There's a lot. So anyway, I really enjoyed the book, and I recommend it. And like I said, I am not an authority on anything other than what got me active and what got me out of bed and starting to think and act on the new information that I was consuming that said that the sugar that I had come to rely on so much was actually killing me. So anyway, that is my review, and as always, keep your head about you.